Hi, this is nichenovus and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, I will explain how I made this sci-fi scene in Blender that was highly requested on my Instagram. So the first and very important thing is setting a Blender scene before we even start making anything. For these videos, I use Eevee render engine, which is much faster and has this beautiful game graphic like effect that makes these scenes look insane. And the render time is also much less compared to Cycles or any other render engine that is used in this line of work. Now keep in mind that this is an intermediate level workflow, so if you are just starting with Blender as a beginner, I would highly recommend getting a basic understanding of the software first and then get back to this video, because this is not a tutorial and I would just like to explain the whole process of how I make these scenes and what the workflow is like. And I really hope that you can learn something out of this. The key steps here are getting an inspiration to make something first, gathering models for kitbashing and basic modeling to build a scene, and then add some visual complexity to it. And then you can always start texturing and adding volumes and some atmosphere to add some depth, and then doing a little bit of animation just to add a certain amount of life to your scenes. So in the first step, I created some towers ranging from a slum tower to a residential building to a cyberpunk building. And all of these structures are made with kitbashed models. Some are from Max Hayes Sci-Fi course, some are from kitbash 3D, and some models I found on Sketchfab. To break down the scene, in the composition, we have a slum tower in the first foreground, one residential block tower in the second foreground, and in the bottom we have these small low poly blocks placed around just to make the scene feel balanced. And then another big tower in the far center of the scene, making the composition very interesting. Now for the slum tower, I gathered a bunch of containers, scaffolding, some slum houses, and then using geometry nodes, I just scattered all of these models on a cube until I was happy with the outcome. Here is the simple geometry node setup for the components that can be added to a cube. Now make sure to apply scale and rotation for all of these models to avoid any problems in scaling and scattering, and use these models as collections to make it easier to scatter. Then you can just add some extra models to add more character and complexity to the towers, and now we have our first foreground structure ready. You can add pipes, cables, staircases, and some gigantic exhaust fans or some telephonic towers, whatever that makes it more live. So for the other structures, the best trick to make such complex looking chaotic buildings is to just compose a lot of thematic buildings in one giant pile and make the composition look very interesting enough to add a bit of character to the scene. So the first one is the Future Slums kit from kitbash 3D, and I added a bunch of models in this huge curated pile. Now the next one is just the same process using another kit, which is I think the cyberpunk kit. And now keep in mind that for this model I removed every texture from every building because it doesn't really need a lot of detail in this particular scene, which is very dark. So the silhouette and the shape of the building and maybe the proportions of the buildings matter more than the actual visual detail of the building. So I usually have like 4 textures in my scenes, and then I just add some volume to it. Maybe some light and atmosphere might actually add a sense of depth to your scenes. Now I will explain how you can make this multi-purpose textures that can be used in multiple models and not make it very repetitive in a minute. For the crowd buildings, I have used a free add-on for Blender called OSM, which is basically this Google OpenStreetMap with 3D information of real world cities. And it gives you this very low poly cluster of building that can be used as supporting crowd models in a scene, just as filler elements. For the composition, I wanted this one point perspective sort of flat view, which can have these tall structures on the sides and at the bottom this tiny blocky city, guiding the eyes of the viewer to the center of the composition. And in the focus, there is this main antagonist tower sort of dominating the whole skyline of the city. So every element is placed in such a way that it guides the focus to the middle, making it more cinematic and dramatic, so to speak. Now don't make it very complicated and just keep it very simple just by adding 2 sun lamps for now. One for more intensity, which adds light to the background, and the other one with less intensity, which is lighting up the foreground building. For volume, I would just make a bunch of cubes covering the main parts of the model and add a volume scatter or principal volume node, whatever you're fine with low volume. The volume here is just to add a bit of depth. Just spend some time setting up volumetrics because it is an integral part of the whole process, and the foreground should be dark and the background should be bright. That is all we are aiming for here. The angle of these sun lamps matters the most actually, and that is what creates this sense of depth and god rays in your cityscape. And this is how the texture setup is done. So in such dark videos, I usually don't use a lot of textures because nothing is going to be seen anyways. So it is best to use 2 to 3 textures which are interacting with the light in a certain way that it gives off a very cool metallic sort of vibe. And here I'll show you how to make 2 of these very simple and quick materials. This first one is for buildings and elements which have interesting shapes but don't really have a place in the foreground, so that the rough texture on it can make it look very interesting. And here I'm going to be using some image textures that you can mix with mix RGB node with a multiply blending mode. Just make sure you use concrete textures. You can get them from maybe textures.com or Unsplash or anywhere on Google. And you can use the color ramp and make it a little bit tighter and join it in the factor to control the relation between these 2 materials. Hue saturation value node and just decrease the saturation value to make it black and white. Now we are going to add another color ramp and connect it to the roughness. Now you can see the relation between the sunlight and the roughness of the texture that makes it more grungy and more interesting. Now we'll just add some bump to it so that we have this roughness, this fake roughness on the texture. Just make sure you decrease the strength of the material, and you can add this to any building to increase the quality of it. Now for the cluster of building, we are going to do the same thing anyways. I learned this trick from this artist called Rui Huang. So I'm just going to add these 2 materials which look like a grid basically. You can use any abstract looking thing, maybe windows, maybe farmlands or whatever, and connect it to the base color, and now you can already see the building window sort of thing going on. Now you just need to control the roughness and metallic property of this texture and just add mapping value to both of these. Keep in mind that you have to connect the object value of the texture coordinate to the mapping. So you can see some sort of stretching going on in the vertical faces of the building. Now don't worry about it because all of this looks very nice when it's very dark and it is interacting with some sort of light source. Again, the same thing, we are going to add a little bit of bump. And now you can see it acts very beautifully with the volume and the light in the scene. And now you can duplicate the buildings as much as you want, and you already have a gigantic city. And you don't really have to worry about making a lot of things or making a lot of models. You can just array the same thing. And after this, all I did was add some more elements to it, maybe some cranes, some roads, some bridges, and some extra buildings, just to add more details to the scene. And also I got some simple cuboids and placed them in the sky just to make them look like flying containers. And also some very low poly ships. When you use a particle system on a plane or something, you can just use it as a flying traffic sort of animation thing. The animation process is very minimal. The camera zooms in and some elements move, that's all. And maybe some flying cars as well, just to add a moving element in the scene itself. And yeah, That's all. Hope you learned something new. Please consider subscribing and liking. The next set of tutorials will be focusing on different types of volumes, bunch of buildings that you can kitbash to make interesting looking structures, different ways to make crowds of buildings that can be used to populate your buildings, and some other, sci-fi structures that I'm planning to make. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed and hope you guys learned something new. See you soon. Peace.